Sometimes confirmation bias gets the best of us, and a while back I had made a fun theory about Caribou discussing the interesting nature of his Logia devil fruit, and at the beginning of that video I had said this.
Caribou also has an open-ended plotline where after discovering the identity of Poseidon, he mentioned that he thinks it would be valuable information for someone, and we still don't know who that someone is, which makes less sense because it doesn't feel like it's the world government or navy. Like, it would be so out of pocket if he was a part of SWORD, for example. And then we've seen Big Mom and Kaido already, Doflamingo as well, and he hasn't had connections with them. And it could be Shanks, but Shanks probably already knows about Shirahoshi given Roger's crew was told about her before she was born. So that technically leaves Blackbeard, but we're still not really sure.
And while the recent chapters substantiate the logic as slated out there, I think I have to accept that this is all probably a clever fake out by Oda. I think Oda is playing me and the readers to make an obvious scenario seem like this is all there was to the perpetually plot twisting character named Caribou. But the more we get of him, the more obscure he becomes. And I think it's a good time to recognize how much more there is to this character. If you're new to the channel,
the way I view the world is by making connections. So let me connect you to my vision, the Parvision.
So I want to clarify that the first Caribou video was discussing how Caribou would continue to be relevant in the story of One Piece and how he has already permeated through nearly every arc in the time skip. And if he wasn't in the manga directly, he was in the cover story that ended up bringing him to Wano. I had made a few videos around this time explaining that Caribou would continue on the Straw Hat's ship, which surprisingly we actually got. But now Caribou exists a little bit beyond my expectations in a weird way, with how he contacted the Blackbeard pirates on Egghead. See, there are a few mysteries we might not get the answer with while we are on Egghead, or ever for that matter, but I do think it might make sense to try and fit Caribou into some of the mysterious or unexplained plot points. For example, Oda made it pretty clear how difficult it was to leave the Labo phase, and if someone were to have left while the laser dome was up, it would cause a very obvious explosion. Anytime the laser dome went down, it was well tracked, and one of the main times it went down, the CP0 and Seraphim seemed to be the only ones capable of maneuvering up to the lab. That being said, going down from Labo phase was actually one of the main challenges for many of the characters. Kizaru had kicked Bonnie and she exploded into the wall. Luffy met the same fate, whereas Vegapunk, Sanji, Frankie, and Atlas took a Vega tank down using cloud wheels. This accounts for all the characters who descended from the Labo phase before we see Caribou nonchalantly on the ground floor. Now, I'm not pointing this out because I think that it was some unfathomable feat that Caribou did that makes him super ninja, super spy in space or something, but more so that Oda was so meticulous about identifying the people coming in and out of this dome. And yet we have a character that just ignored all of that and found himself in arguably the most dangerous part of the island to plead his case to the Blackbeard pirates, who they themselves are another mysterious aspect of this arc, in that according to the information we left with, theoretically they couldn't have left the island with the current capabilities of Van Augur's warp fruit, and we don't know the full conclusion of their decision to bring Caribou along with them. This scene seems straightforward, but it might not be. On the surface, Caribou wants to survive the Buster Call on Egghead, so he's trying to find someone to save him. If we went a layer deeper, the reason why he wouldn't just stay with the Straw Hats despite watching them take down Kaido and survive so many other catastrophes is because he doesn't want to be targeted by their enemies too. And if we were to take what Caribou says at face value, then he was trying to find Blackbeard all along. He wanted to join them for his entire life. And that mystery man that Caribou mentioned back in Fisherman Island who he wanted to give the ancient weapon info to would be Blackbeard, or as he puts it, Master Teach. But there's a problem in this statement by Caribou in that it's either a huge obvious lie or Oda just tied Caribou to Blackbeard in a deep way. What Caribou says is, "My name is Caribou, just a humble pirate at your service. I've been looking for you folks. See, there's a certain someone who's inspired me to go out to sea in the first place." So this part is interesting because if Caribou wanted to find Blackbeard, it wouldn't have been that hard. At Sabaody, we saw Caribou was pretty well enough established that underwater travel wasn't even a concern for him. Instead of looking for Blackbeard, he was playing games with Tomorrow Black and trying to kill Luffy supposedly. And if he wanted to be under Blackbeard, then it's pretty obvious where one would find him given the infamy of the Rocky Port incident and the fact that one of the main reasons he was named a Yonko was in junction to the fact that he was the boss of Pirate Island, the most famous pirate haven in the world. It wouldn't really be hard to find them. But that's not the weird part. It was the next part, which was that he said, "My lifelong dream is to be one of Master Blackbeard Teach's goons. Please, you gotta just let me see him in person. I'm begging ya." That's odd, right? Because he said a lifelong dream. Caribou is 32, which let's say he was inspired at the regular One Piece age of 8. That would be 24 years ago, which ironically is the year Roger was executed and the golden age of pirates started. But it wouldn't be until Caribou is 30 years old that he would have heard of Blackbeard, because Blackbeard didn't become his own pirate until over 2 years ago, nor did he ever carry the name Blackbeard. He went by Marshall D. Teach, which in that regard, Caribou calling him Master Teach is interesting, and I'll explain why in a second, but what I need to remind you of before that is not only Blackbeard not really well known before he became an independent pirate who betrayed Whitebeard, he was so unknown that he didn't even have a bounty. Yes, this was confirmed during the conversation between Kuma and Moria when it came to discussing Blackbeard's new warlord status. So not only was Blackbeard not his name, but Marshall D. Teach had no world government bounty, and even Shanks had said that Blackbeard was just hiding in the shadows of Whitebeard waiting for his moment to creep up. So how could it be that it was Caribou's lifelong mission to be Master Blackbeard Teach's goon? Now, there is a world where Blackbeard as Marshall D. Teach played a Shanks role for Caribou and inspired him in that way. But even in that way, it would be weird because it's not like Blackbeard was a commander or had his own goons during the Whitebeard time. He even turned down leadership roles, which is why I said earlier there is a possibility Oda wants to create a very deep, possibly one-sided relationship between Caribou and Blackbeard, where maybe a small appearance of Blackbeard ended up becoming a huge iconic moment for Caribou, where he saved Caribou or ended up looking really cool. It could be that Caribou witnessed the moment Blackbeard scarred Shanks, for example, and that ended up becoming his inspiration somehow. I'm not saying it's impossible for Oda to insert a scenario that could explain this connection, but the alternative is much simpler in that Caribou could just be lying. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't want to assume he's just making it all up, but if we look back at how Caribou tried to brown-nose Luffy, it was said with all the same exclamation points and mannerisms. Caribou is always plotting for his escape while saying anything that will allow him safe passage out of a dangerous scenario, which Egghead would have provided him. But even from Blackbeard's angle, it's also a little odd. I mean, the guy was one-track mindedly searching for the Yami Yami no Mi and really didn't show much care for anything else. He even turned down promotions, so how would a meriless pirate like Marshall D. Teach even become an icon for the ruthless Caribou that we see today? But that's where I'm going to throw a little bit of a curveball. See, even I thought Caribou's character was a straightforward villain, scummy type of character, but Oda has been sneaking some very interesting roles for him. So first off, Caribou is seemingly a godly man. When we were introduced to him, he was actually giving tribute to his lord. They were worried if the fake Straw Hats would upset their lord, but Caribou proceeded to offer them as some sort of burial tribute. Now, the important part isn't the burying, and it's not the lord part actually. I mean, it could be for other reasons, but I want to direct your attention to who he buried, or more appropriately, who he said he was burying. It's Damaro Black's crew, minus Damaro Black. And that is really confusing because we saw recently that at least fake Frankie, fake Zoro, and fake Sanji are locked up with Damaro Black in the G4 naval base. These fake Straw Hats were the ones that Caribou had in custody at Sabaody and was leisurely trying to bury. The thing is, we could maybe think that they got chased out, but what we see is that Sentomaru, who captured Damaro Black, makes the report that Caribou and the other pirates disappeared from the plaza along with some of the other fake Straw Hats. And while I think Sentomaru is capable of beating Caribou, other than him, there wasn't really that many that could probably take down Caribou or force his hand. And what we see is that Caribou not only was stated to have been lost by Sentomaru, but he proceeds to chase after the Straw Hats immediately after. And so what we're left with is that Caribou didn't actually bury these fake Straw Hats, but instead turned them into the Navy for some reason, or left them tied up to be captured instead of burying them. I'm not saying Caribou is some good hero type of character, but this is definitely an interesting detail. I find it a little interesting that apparently Sentomaru, who is also on Egghead right now, was the one who ultimately ended up taking the rest of the fake Straw Hats since he had custody of Damaro Black and they all ended up in the same prison. But that's not where the weird details about Caribou ends, because while we have covered Fishman Island and parts of Wano before in regards to Caribou, I want to bring our focus to the cover story that Oda had for Caribou. To summarize it, after Fishman Island, where Peckham's punched Caribou unconscious, Caribou woke up and tried to kidnap mermaids again. Jinbei stopped him and decided to personally bring Caribou to Naval Base G5, which isn't the same base where Damaro Black was, but ironically is the naval base where Smoker asked to be transferred to. But I'm not sure if that's relevant at the moment. Anyways, somehow Caribou's brother Caribou found him and fought the G5 base long enough to set Caribou free, where we see Caribou escapes by himself, but then Caribou gets shipwrecked and washes up on none other than Kaido's favorite island. I'm not joking, we've covered this before. This was the same island that Drake first went to after Sabaody to get supposedly recruited by Kaido. Now, in this cover story, the situation on the island was really complex, but to shorten the relevant parts is that Kaido's commander Scotch was here running a weapons operation that Caribou spied on. This grandma who saved Caribou had a grandson who looked just like Caribou, and was a commander of the local revolutionary army that was fighting the oppression of Kaido's forces. Scotch wiped out the remnants of those revs, including that grandma, and to defend the grandma, Caribou coincidentally found his brother Caribou, and they teamed up to take down Scotch. They succeeded, but then randomly came in Drake to defeat Caribou with no effort, and that's when Drake captured Caribou and took him to Wano. There was weirdly no resistance offered here. Though Caribou fought pretty hard against Scotch, it seemed like he went along with Drake almost. And even weirder is that Caribou begged that Drake protect grandmas, and Drake captured Caribou, put him in Udon prison it seems, but just left the rest of Caribou's crew completely untouched. Now you know me, I think the cover stories are really important, especially as we are seeing important details like Vegapunk's history with Mads and Pudding's capture by Blackbeard's crew fleshed out in the cover stories, nearly concurrent with how it's relevant in the chapter. But also in 2018, Oda was asked which characters would you like to go into detail about if you had time, and he said that there is a helpful means of the cover stories in One Piece, specifically for that purpose. In other words, the cover stories are a way for him to touch on details that he couldn't cover within the chapters, and for that reason I think it's really crazy that Oda gave Caribou a 44 chapter long cover story arc, which for the record is longer than Enel's and the Vinsmokes. So given the precedent, I think it's important to pay attention to why Oda did this. So let's describe the weird parts of the cover story first. Was Drake there the entire time? I mean, it's already of note that Drake as a Tobi Roppo is just chilling outside of Wano. It could be that he was checking up on the island and it coincided perfectly with all of this, or that Drake was there the entire time. And remember, Drake's role in Kaido's operation, he is gaining his trust at minimum. This is a Drake who previously burned down Amigasa village, so why would he care about this island's revolutionary squabbles? But more so, if he was here already, why would he let Scotch get taken down? I'm pretty sure Kaido would be upset regardless if Drake captured the perpetrator, but also even if Drake wasn't there the entire time and showed up just as Caribou was celebrating victory, why did Drake just take him away? And unlike every other time, Caribou and his lackeys didn't relentlessly attack. I'm not trying to build them up, but Caribou's brother chased after the Straw Hats, Jinbei, and fought a Navy base all for Caribou. Then they fought a Kaido associate. They're a tenacious bunch, but then they just watched Drake whisk away Caribou to Wano. It's almost as if Drake knows Caribou somehow. Which another thing to consider is that when Caribou is in Udon, he never mentions Drake or complains about why he is in there in the first place. All he says to Luffy is that he's been in there much longer than Luffy, so he knows a few things. But can we talk about the things he knows about? First of all, without Caribou, Luffy probably wouldn't have been able to escape Udon that easily. It's almost entirely because of Caribou that he escaped successfully, because not only did he hide Raizo from the guards, but he got the keys to break free of the cuffs, and this is the most curious part. He had the intel on how the boss Denden Mushi worked. He seemingly knew how to take down the communication network that allowed Luffy's prison break to go unnoticed because they fed false reports but also prevented reports from going out prior. Which that should be when you're kind of wondering, if Caribou was a prisoner like Kid and everyone else, wouldn't that mean he had the same restrictions? I mean, he had the handcuffs on him too. How did Caribou find out about all of these details about the handcuffs and the Denden Mushi network and then immediately put it all into action? It's also not the first time Caribou has shown a high level of resourceful intelligence. When we remember the Straw Hat's journey to Fishman Island, he explained how underwater travel works, like an expert would. But also when the Straw Hats were in a pinch and needed to fight, he was the one who concocted the plan for Luffy, Zoro, Sanji to fight with the underwater bubble scuba gear. But going back to the point is specifically the intel that Caribou has is beyond just knowing about how the boss snail works. He also knows exactly where it is. Now, I'm no conspiracy theorist, but isn't this a lot for Caribou to have figured out on his own while his devil fruit was apparently down? Wouldn't it make more sense that a spy Tobi Roppo member who actually was a part of SWORD, who needed something specific, decided to plant Caribou into the prison for some specific reason, and gave him the information about how the snails and cuffs worked? Another thing that was shocking was that when Luffy needed him most, Caribou showed up on Wano with a month's worth of food, but food was really scarce in Wano. He had just been with everyone in Udon and been there much longer than Luffy too. Not only that, we get to follow every every step Caribou took to get to Wano, and he's basically a prisoner the entire time since leaving Fishman Island, so much so that he was given a lunchbox of his favorite meat pies before leaving with Drake. So how did he get all of that food? Wouldn't it make sense that if he was planted in the prison by Drake, that he would have stockpiled food in there so he could survive? The whole point of Kaido's prison was to starve people and overwork them in labor camps, and over time they would either die or pledge allegiance to Kaido. But Caribou didn't even seem like the long time in Udon prison affected him at all. So does this mean that Drake had wanted to bring Caribou to Wano on purpose? He let Caribou take down Scotch, which could have indicated Drake's real allegiance if he'd paid attention, but also brought Caribou to Wano to debrief him and have him infiltrate the prison so that Drake could free a few prisoners? I'm honestly not sure where this idea goes, other than the fact that this has to point to how insanely well positioned Caribou always is. He is always able to hear about the ancient weapons, and basically without him at Udon, or Tokage Port where Luffy fell from Onigashima, and even low-key before Fishman Island, the crew would have had a much more difficult time without Caribou. And now coming back to Egghead, he just happens to be the only character that somehow made it from Labo phase to Fabrio phase during the phase of Egghead where not only was it the most dangerous because Saturn transformed, there was also a Buster Call, and it was flooded by Marines, and he was in a laser dome defended cloud in the sky that at minimum would have alerted entry in or out. There is the mystery about who gave Luffy that food still, but for him to miraculously find Van Augur and Canary Devon during all of the chaos, to then tell an obvious lie or an insanely interesting connection to Marshall D. Teach shouldn't be overlooked. And even when we remember the way he is pandering to Van Augur, it's literally the same way he's trying to gain favor with Luffy. But aside from all of that, there will always be one thing that will be a definite mark of suspicion for me. It was the basis for the first theory video on Caribou, and it was that to Luffy, Caribou registers as a wild animal. And Luffy seemed to accept that Caribou was a good enough person to have changed from before. Those two things to me are important details that on top of the plethora of other interesting details gives me the idea that Oda is preparing something massive for this character. It's an odd thing because in the original video I pretty much just wrote off that the simplest and most logical answer would be that Blackbeard was the character that Caribou wanted to bring the treasure and information to. And it still makes sense, though we haven't seen Blackbeard pursue the ancient weapons yet. He is the guy who would definitely care about having more cards to play and use as leverage. But because the way Caribou presented himself here, I'm thinking there's another person we missed. The idea that comes to mind is actually Randy Troy's theory that he proposed a long time ago, that Caribou is a continuation of Mr. 10 from Baroque Works. He was mentioned in the story but never introduced, but Oda gave us a concept art that looks eerily similar to Caribou, which would mean that the somebody he wants to tell is actually Crocodile and not Blackbeard. It could make sense why then he was set on hunting down Luffy at the start. Collecting treasure is important for someone who loans money out on the scale of Buggy's operations, and obviously since Crocodile was searching for Pluton, the ancient weapons are a perfect match. Randy Troy added a lot more to the idea, including how the devil fruit synergies between Crocodile and Caribou are primed to be paired with, but while I agree to all of that, there's just something odd about the interactions Caribou has had with the Navy. Remember, the fake Straw Hats weren't buried, they were given to the Navy. And more precisely, the situation with Drake. Remember how I mentioned how tenacious Caribou's brother was in retrieving Caribou? When the Kraken destroyed Caribou's ship, they were basically already at Titanic depths 3,000 meters below in the ocean. Yet, they survived that and got their ship remade and made it to Fishman Island. How are they able to survive that and completely remake their destroyed ship in such a short period of time? Then when Jinbei took Caribou after Fishman Island, Caribou chased after Jinbei underwater. And when Jinbei dropped Caribou off at G5, Caribou followed and freed him. Caribou and the crew were defeated and in custody of G5. That's when Caribou left on his ship alone and got shipwrecked and made it to the island that Kaido held. But somehow, Caribou escaped G5 while riding a Navy ship and tracked Caribou down here to Kaido's island and helped Caribou fight a war against a Kaido subordinate, and they finally won. The picture I'm painting is the tenaciousness of Caribou and Caribou subordinates. It's honestly downright impressive. We hadn't seen this out of the Heart Pirates or Kid Pirates, and while they were this tenacious, you know what happened when Drake showed up? Caribou just let him go. It seemed like there was a fight, but not only did Caribou not try to pursue Caribou after this, but he saluted Drake as he dragged Caribou away. It seems that the revolutionaries and Caribou were saluting Caribou, but isn't this whole picture weird? Because Drake is a certified Kaido Tobiropo at this point, and the revolutionaries and Caribou just respect their opposition to take their cherished commander? Now, I'm not expecting Caribou to make it to Wano, but considering they chased after Jinbei, fought an entire navy base, even if they lost to Drake once, wouldn't they just chase after just like they did after they lost at G5? But also, why did G5 let Caribou go? Remember, this is Smoker's base, as he is the vice admiral and highest level commander that we know that was transferred to G5. So it could be said that Smoker let Caribou go. And then how did both Caribou and Drake track Caribou to Kaido's private island? And why did Drake not take Caribou's brother into custody with Caribou? That's all when I landed on a really weird possibility, which is that it might be that Caribou is a part of SWORD. I know, hold on, I'm not saying that without understanding how wild that would be. There's a huge asterisk on this. But if Caribou were SWORD, then it could explain why, though he is a pirate, the captured pirates he held were then found with the Navy. We have seen Drake act as a pirate while actively in SWORD, and both were given the very hefty rumor that they were cold-blooded killers. Drake was a fallen Navy officer that killed many people apparently, and Caribou was a Navy soldier killer. If SWORD inserted a spy into the worst generation with Drake, maybe they did it again with the new super rookies after the time skip. Caribou committed heinous crimes like kidnapping the mermaids, but when you read it back, it's actually not the mermaids he wanted. He wanted fast cash. The only reason he went after Shirahoshi was because she was Poseidon, but he said he doesn't need treasure anymore since he robbed the castle. So if we were to assume that he was given the rights to commit crimes according to his mission, then it wouldn't be crazy since we saw Drake literally burn down Amigasa village, the place where Tama was from. And again, none of this proves that Caribou is in SWORD, but it would explain the interesting interaction between Caribou's crew and Drake. If Caribou was in SWORD and Drake was his commanding officer, then them no longer pursuing Caribou after Drake takes him into custody would make sense. It would explain why Caribou was allowed to leave from G5 after being defeated, if Smoker had intel that the base's commodore was unaware of. It would also explain why Drake didn't bring Caribou as added labor despite having an entire ship to do so, and just took Caribou. If Caribou was in allegiance in some part with Drake, then it could explain why, though he was imprisoned by Drake in Wano under the oppressive beast pirates, he had the information on the sea stone cuffs and more importantly the Denden Mushis. He was literally prepped to instigate a breakout for Udon, which though we may not know the purpose for why Drake would need this, we can recognize that Oda gave Caribou this role. And I'll reel it back because none of this is all that convincing without figuring out Caribou's source. Where is he from? I mean, if I'm right, then either Caribou is manipulating Caribou and all of his men, or they are also in SWORD. And I think that might be the more correct answer, and the clue might lie in the henchmen that Caribou has. They're all basically clones, and they're similar to Caribou. And it was when I was looking at the Wano panel of Caribou that it dawned on me, this glorp sound effect. It had me thinking, what if Caribou wasn't a character? Oh no, Pars lost it. Yeah, I roped you into this wild idea that Oda had us bamboozled all this time, thinking that Caribou and his crew were real people. And I guess technically he is a character by technical standards, but what I mean is that Luffy might be right. It might be more accurate to say that Caribou is a wild animal. To explain this, it could be possible that Caribou is a golem of some sort, more specifically a creation of the glorp glorp human Prince Grus. Obviously the glorp sound effect that Caribou had in that last panel in Wano was just the light bulb for this idea, because it seems that Oda uses a mixture of different sound effects for Caribou as he does with the Prince's golems. While some match up, we also don't have a huge amount on Prince Grus to know everything about him, but what we do know is that he can create golems of various different sizes, and they're pretty formidable as they're holding their own on Pirate Island in the New World, which shouldn't really be surprising since we saw a similar ability with Cracker, who could create insanely powerful biscuit puppets, but while Cracker's puppets remain silent unless he was inside controlling it, Prince Grus's golems are on another level. They are sentient basically. They look like individuals, but when struck, a golem was shown saying that hurts, and then reforming. And when it reformed, it basically looks like Caribou, and it's even more convincing when you realize all of the spectators, including us, until we saw Prince Grus's powers, we thought that it was some kind of Logia. They questioned if it was clay, and that's interesting because clay naturally forms in swampy areas, so the swamp fruit that Caribou has. While again, we don't know how Prince Grus's power functions on himself, we see him literally making a mini clone clone of himself, while his golems are autonomously fighting the pirates. If Luffy had faced one of these golems, he might recognize that it feels more like he was fighting a wild animal, just like he did with Caribou. If Caribou and his crew were golems created by Grus, then it would explain the entire cover story as to how they could be so insanely durable, but also bypass the Navy. We know the captain of SWORD, Drake, was a rear admiral in the Navy and was tasked with recon that ultimately led him into Kaido's crew. Couldn't it be possible that Prince Grus was given the same task, but instead of doing it himself, especially given how spread out SWORD was, and possibly his personal quirk of being a prince, he instead made an extremely high level golem that was meant to infiltrate Blackbeard's crew. That's why Caribou would tell Van Augur that it's his lifelong mission to become Master Blackbeard Teach's henchman. If he was created by Grus to do this, then it would fit pretty well. It would explain who their lord is too. If they were created by Prince Grus, it would make sense and explain how when they said they would bury the fake Straw Hats, they ended up in Navy custody anyways. It would explain why Smoker would have left Caribou out of G5. It would explain why Caribou didn't continue to pursue Caribou after Drake took custody of him. And on another note, on the lord angle, Caribou was burying the fake Straw Hats for this lord, but prior to this, we see Caribou attacking a marine, and during that squabble, he had repeatedly asked for the lord to forgive him for hurting the soldier, which we never see Caribou ask his lord for forgiveness before, and it just so happens to be when he is attacking the Navy, which would make sense since their lord Prince Grus would probably avoid hurting the Navy men even at the cost of a SWORD mission. If this is the right logic, then yes, Caribou probably always intended to go into Blackbeard's crew using money and information as leverage, but interestingly, when he was introduced, he wasn't chasing either. He really wanted to claim Luffy's bounty. And I think that originally was something Prince Grus probably slated out for Caribou, for the sole reason of his rivalry with Kobe. Prince Grus doesn't like that Kobe is considered the future of the Navy and is Garp's protege to the point that he says that he would sabotage him. So if that rivalry runs deep enough, then he might have set Caribou loose to hunt the Straw Hats because the hero of the Marines, Kobe, reveres Luffy, a pirate, which as a higher ranked SWORD member, Prince Grus probably doesn't like. My guess is that Prince Grus probably wants to prove something to Kobe, whereas Kobe believes in Luffy no matter what. And this might be connected to that scene we saw in Drake's flashback to this conversation with Kobe around Luffy back at SWORD's headquarters. Kobe probably had a similar scene in the past with Prince Grus, so claiming Luffy's bounty would have pleased their lord. And another significant note is that Caribou called Blackbeard Master, not Lord. So it could be that this simple distinction that further solidifies that Caribou is digging much deeper than what he lets on. Now, all of this is a really intricate theory, but it wouldn't be odd for Oda to give this kind of power to Prince Grus by making him the Clayman. He actually gave him a power with one of the most deep-seated connections to our world's lore, in that basically universally every belief system down to the Abrahamic religions all have some form of creation theory where humans were birthed from clay. And in some lore, there are different types, and there's also different roles. A stark example is the one we are facing with Emeth, where in Judaism, they had golems, but they weren't exactly the same as mankind. But separate from that, it was basically all stories that would support this level of power from Prince Grus, and it would also make him the named lord that created Caribou. The only thing I couldn't really explain with Caribou is his power to infinitely store items, but when I compared it to the fact that Doflamingo's clone was able to use Doflamingo's ultimate ability, Birdcage, then if Prince Grus had an ultimate ability, I don't see why he couldn't allow Caribou to use it. There are more intricate levels to this theory that combine with my original theory or depart, where some involve Vegapunk, but they're quite lengthy to explain, and this video is way more in depth than I originally intended. It's of note that Caribou said that his storage power was like a hungry gal or a bottomless stomach, hinting at some sort of shared sentience, which if you know my double-layered eye theories, then you know how that could fit in. And you know those eyes are important since Mihawk and Emu share the same design. But you can check my other videos for that, links are in the description. But the last thing I wanted to say was it could be that this theory could explain what Smoker was seen dragging behind him in the ocean in chapter 11-17. We see what looks like to be a giant crate with an X, or just a cross made by wooden support beams. And if that's the case, maybe it's just the giant crate that randomly appears after Caribou beats Scotch and swallows Kaido's factory. This island was apparently right next to Smoker's base, and it doesn't seem like Drake takes this box off the island. And interestingly, Caribou swallowed an entire factory, and while it was Kaido's and it would have made sense to connect back to Kaido and Wano, this never became relevant. I mean, either Caribou is still holding onto it, or maybe somehow Caribou can discharge parts of him and leave them behind. It would be kind of crazy for Caribou to have a power like that, but honestly, with how insanely intertwined Oda had made this character already, I think especially now that we're seeing him continue to have not just relevance, but importance well into the last saga, and on a tier where he is one of the few characters not in the main cast that knows the most current information on the ancient weapons, is kind of insane. This is a character that has been with Luffy for so much of the time skip, interacted with Sword, and now is making moves towards Blackbeard. On top of that, the heightened importance of the eye design that we see in the likes of the Seraphim, but also Caribou having similar eyes to Mihawk and Emu, makes this character even more interesting. But before we end it, if I wanted to throw in a cool detail to support the idea that Caribou isn't a true character, I could add that after Fishman Island, Oda never added Caribou to the list of main characters present in the volumes during Wano or Egghead, which is wild considering Caribou literally learned about Pluton, and while he didn't hear Luffy's dreams, he is on the Thousand Sunny. He is also the main reason Luffy recovered during the raid and escaped Udon too, but Oda has avoided mentioning him as a character in the volume's table of context. And that's wild, right? Can you imagine a character showing up and riding the ship twice now, and not even getting mentioned in the credits? I can't see the latest volume character list to further substantiate this, but the latest one I can go off is chapter 1056, where in that volume, Caribou shows up in 3 chapters, which include learning about Pluton and being present for Luffy's dream reveal. And I also wanted to note that somehow the first Logia in the time skip still hasn't had a full Viver card release. I could be wrong, but when I checked, all I could find was the birthday and food. And on top of that, he also just randomly has like no SBS aside for the one about the dreams and that he didn't hear Luffy's dream. And despite all of that, he has an entire cover story miniseries that has 46 parts. That's more than a Nell's cover story and the Germa cover story. And remember how Oda said that cover stories are how he is able to get parts of the story he wants to explain but can't get to in the manga. So what was he trying to show us here? And I'll leave it at that for now. Let me know what you think and consider subscribing and sharing this video. It would mean a lot.
And so, like always, thank you for connecting with me, and I'm looking forward to connecting with you all on the next Parvision.